This is a production of Cornell University.
So the talk is about climate justice, economics and philosophy. There's the outline. I'll introduce things, and then I'm going to get on to economics, talk about efficiency, distribution, and externalities. Then move to climate economics, which is essentially talking about externalities over time, between generations, and then end with some philosophical considerations. I want to finish in about 30 minutes so that we have some time for discussions, probably less than 30 minutes. So here are some propositions. The proposition is that climate justice requires sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. It brings together justice between generations and justice within generations. And in particular, and this is the important point, it requires that attempts to address justice between generations through various interventions designed to curb greenhouse emissions today do not end up creating injustice in our time by hurting the currently poor and vulnerable. That's the key trade-off that I want to get across to you in this talk. And what I'll do is to develop these points in greater detail. Well, as you know, I'm an economist, and so I'm a practitioner of what is known as the dismal science. And it's probably fair to say that economists are seen with some suspicion by those of you who are concerned about climate change. It's probably fair to say that economists are seen with some suspicion by those who are concerned about justice. Well, hell, they're seen as suspicious by almost everybody these days. Now, I will admit to you that economics as a discipline has its faults, and I'm going to confess to some of those faults as we go along. But in my view, a key virtue of economics is that it looks always to identify trade-offs, where they exist and where they don't exist. If they don't exist, then you can have win-win, so to speak. When they do exist, you can't have everything. You have to give up something to get something. And it's the identification of those trade-offs at which I believe economics excels and what it brings to the table. Oh, what happened there?
Come up the entire time.
Sorry about that. Okay. So, and the point is that where these trade-offs exist, much of the time, economics really does need to give way to philosophy to get a sharper sense of the basic normative principles which can help weigh the different elements of the trade-off. Now, I'm not a philosopher, and I don't play one on TV, but I do consort with philosophers from time to time. And some philosophy has indeed rubbed off on me. There's going to be a big conference at Cornell on May the 24th, 25th on climate justice, called Climate Justice, Economics and Philosophy, and you can get the details from the Atkinson Center website. And this is jointly organized with Henry Shue, who some of you will remember as actually a philosophy professor at Cornell from some years ago, who's now at Oxford, and is perhaps one of the most distinguished philosophers of climate justice in the world today. Over the past 2 years, Henry and I have been involved with some others in something called the Climate Justice Dialogue, which is led by Mary Robinson, who again, as some of you may recognize as being the former President of Ireland, and now she's UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's Special Envoy on Climate Change. Henry and I are both members of the advisory committee, and we've both written about this, and there are some perspectives in that on those links there. And I presume this will be made available to whoever wants it. So. I'll get rid of that. Okay. So I presume that people who want these slides can get them, and you can click on those and go to the web links there. So let's get started then in terms of the economics, and I want to emphasize three basic concepts: efficiency, distribution, starting with efficiency and distribution, and then we'll get on to externalities. Now, without getting too technical, efficiency essentially asks the question: is the economic pie as large as it could be given the resource constraints? Obviously, if the resource constraints weren't there, we could have a very huge economic pie. The question is, how large can the economic pie be given the constraints that we face? That's the question that economics strives for. That's the question that economics strives to answer, at least one of the questions. And further, economics identifies the role of markets in achieving this efficiency. Under certain conditions, and it's important to note it's under certain conditions, the conditions being that market prices reflect the true social scarcity of commodities, then there will indeed be efficient production of these commodities. The requirement is that market prices reflect the social scarcity, and we'll see cases where market prices don't reflect this social scarcity. Okay? But if that happens, and economics tries to identify those situations where it does happen, then the economic pie will be as large as possible, given the resource constraints. However, as you can all guess, and as you all know, an outcome can be efficient and yet be highly inequitable and unjust. So this very large pie can be very unequally distributed. And I think economics gets a bad rap, really, for saying that economists ignore distribution, that all they're concerned about is efficiency, not distribution. Actually, economics and economists worry a lot about distribution, but they do so in their own way. Okay? Much of the focus of economics is on income and wealth inequality, as you might guess. Okay? For example, the recent work of the economists Emmanuel Sayers and Thomas Piketty showed the sharply rising share of the top 1% in US and Europe. The reason why we use the terms 1% and 99% is because of the work of these economists. They looked at the share of the top 1% and showed that over the last 30 years, it's been rising dramatically in US and in Europe. And the divide 1%, 99% is essentially put forward by these economists from very detailed analysis of economic data, of income and expenditure and wealth. Or there's the work of another economist, Amartya Sen, whose classic work on famines in developing countries showed that famines are often the consequence not of overall food shortage. Sometimes you can have overall food not being in shortage, in other words, the size of the pie, but because of shortage for some. It's because of the distribution of the pie that you can get famines, not necessarily because of the size of the pie. This is the Nobel Prize winning of Amartya Sen. So, with that in mind, let's come back to efficiency. I'm going to come to distribution in a minute, but let's come back to efficiency. And one of the central reasons that economics identifies as to why markets may not be fully efficient is the presence of externalities. What is an externality? I mean, we can have a very technical definition. That's not the object of this lecture. Here's a Wikipedia definition. An externality is the cost or benefit that affects a party who did not choose to incur that cost or benefit. Let me flip it around. If I take an action which has consequences for you, which I don't fully take into account, which I don't fully internalize to my actions, that is an externality. Okay, so if I do something and I don't take into account the consequences for you, and the market doesn't mediate those consequences, that is an externality. Okay? Because I don't internalize the consequences to you of my action. And the classic example of an externality was given by the great British economist Arthur Pigou in the early part of the 20th century. His example was the laundry and the factory. Just think of the early 20th century. This laundry does the washing, and then it hangs out the washing, the clean white linen, on lines outside. Okay? And there it is, it's fluttering in the wind, blowing. And then a factory sets up next door, and there's a smokestack and starts belching smoke into the atmosphere. The soot gets onto the laundry. That is an externality. The factory has caused an externality to the laundry. And there's a cost to the laundry, which of course the factory owner is not taking into account in his calculations of how much smoke to emit, etc. That's a classic externality, and all economists are brought up on this Pigou externality, named after the British economist Pigou. Suppose I was to replace the laundry by ordinary citizens who are breathing the smoke, then of course that's pollution as you normally understand it. But actually, let me replace the factory by ordinary citizens who are driving their motor vehicles. They are then causing the externality for others. So it's not just the big bad factory, it's all of us driving our vehicles who are causing the externality, because we're not taking into account the cost of that on others as we drive around in our ordinary business. The point is, though, that with these externalities, with these spillover effects, the scarcity value of a commodity is misstated by the market price. In this case, the scarce commodity is clean air, whose price is zero. The factory, so to speak, in polluting is actually using up clean air, so to speak, okay, at a price of zero. It doesn't have to pay any cost for that. The price is zero, and there's overconsumption, there's an externality being caused. There's a gap between the market price, which in this case is literally zero, and the social cost that's being caused by this activity. So what's the answer? What's the answer to a situation where market prices don't reflect the true scarcity value, the true social cost of a commodity or an activity? The economist's answer, as you might expect, is to tax that activity. You make that activity more expensive so that the cost to the person undertaking that activity matches its social cost. Previously, the market price was not matching the social cost. You now raise the market price by taxing that commodity. Okay? All of you who go to Wegmans to shop know the last line is the tax. Okay? There's an 8% tax added onto your cost. Okay? In other words, the price that you pay is tax inclusive. And this is the classic economist way of thinking. There's a gap between market price and the social cost. You tax that activity to raise the market price to bring it close to the social cost. And these taxes are known after Pigou as Pigovian taxes. An absolutely central concept in economics, a Pigovian tax, named after Pigou. It's a tax which taxes the perpetrator of this externality for the cost that person is incurring, his activity is impinging on others. So, a basic framework in economics is that Pigovian taxes on pollution, for example, can get you closer to efficiency by making market prices reflect the true scarcity value of the thing, let's say in this case, clean air. So it gets you to efficiency, closer to efficiency, but it can also have distributional consequences. Of what sort? Well, there are gainers and losers to this Pigovian tax. Okay? Who gains, who loses? Well, certainly those who pay the taxes lose as a result of this. Well, this may be fine and okay if these are the big bad corporations that we typically think of as being the polluters. But very often, as I said before, these people who are being taxed now to overcome the externality are actually just ordinary citizens, many of them poor citizens. For example, think of the implications of higher gasoline taxes, which is a classic suggested recommendation for dealing with pollution. Think of the implications of higher gasoline taxes for those who have to drive long distances to their low-paid jobs. They lose as a result of this, of trying to fix this problem. They're the losers in this thing. Obviously, the gainers are those who are now not being polluted, but there are losers. There are gainers and losers. There's a trade-off. There's no such thing as a free lunch here. And the point is that unless you design compensation, unless compensation is designed to address these distributional consequences, to help those poor people who are now going to be made worse off as a result of this tax, the seemingly good environmental policy may well be solving the pollution problem on the backs of some of the poor. And that is the trade-off that I want to get across in this lecture, that I want us to focus on in this lecture. So let me move now to climate economics, namely externalities over time. So I've been thinking up to now about the laundry and the factory at a given point in time. Okay? At the same point in time, the smoke is hitting the laundry, etc. Let's now think about externalities over time. So we think of the consequences of the factory affecting not just the laundry today, but generations to come, because, of course, of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. Okay? So we think now of externalities as extending over time to multiple future generations. And climate science tells us that greenhouse gas emissions today will have substantial effect on the well-being of those living 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now. That is the externality. Our actions today have negative consequences for somebody else, and they have no say in the matter. Laundry, factory, today's generations, future generations, it's a similar structure. And that's how economists come to this problem, thinking about externalities over time. So, as I said, what's happening with climate change is that the activities of the present generation, us, are exerting an externality on future generations. And market prices today are not reflecting the true social costs and benefits. In particular, the social cost to future generations, because, of course, they're not here to express their market preferences. Okay? If you're going out buying apples or milk or whatever, you're expressing your preferences, your demand for that commodity. Okay? But future generations are not here to express that demand. The market doesn't exist. Therefore, it's the commodity clean air or clean atmosphere is underpriced, and we're overusing it. So, for the economist, this is straightforward. There's an inefficiency caused by an externality, in this case, over time, not at a point in time between laundry and factory, but over time. And what's the answer? The economist's answer is to introduce Pigovian taxes. You try to correct that externality by raising the cost to those who are causing that externality. And since it's the present generation which is causing the cost, we should tax the economist's argument would be you should tax the present generation, raise the cost of carbon for them so that they will consume less of it. That way, you're correcting the gap between the market price and the social cost. Now taking into account in the social cost, the preferences of future generations as well. So note that when we come to this conclusion, economists are not that different from climate activists. Okay? Climate activists, I mean, I know there are very, very many different types of climate activists. They argue for a carbon tax. They argue for limits on carbon emissions. Or more forcefully, some argue for the end of coal. Okay? And of course, I can have a carbon tax, but a limit on carbon emissions is like an infinite tax on carbon beyond a certain point. Okay? You say, if you emit more than X kilotons of carbon, we will do something nasty to you. That's what's meant by there being an upper limit. Okay? You'll be put in prison or whatever it is. There's a regulation. You can't emit more than this. Assuming it's well enforced, the economic counterpart of that is like having a very, very high tax on emission beyond 1,000 kilotons or whatever the limit is. Okay? So these are all consistent with each other. Essentially, what you want to do is to raise the cost of the activity which is causing the externality. And the economists' efficiency-based arguments are not that different, in my view, from climate activists' argument, which says you have to stop consuming this thing which is causing this problem for future generations. So, efficiency, so far so good. But. The question always arises, as it arose in the case of the laundry and the factory, who is going to bear the cost of this Pigovian tax? Somebody somewhere has to bear the cost of this. Okay? Obviously, those who were previously benefiting from its absence are now going to bear the cost of the Pigovian tax. If these people who were previously benefiting and are now going to pay the cost are rich fat cats, well and good. I suppose. If you're egalitarian, then fine, no problem. But what if the direct or indirect cost of the end of fossil fuel, for example, is paid in the short to medium term by poor countries and by the poor in rich countries? As the price of energy rises, as the price of gasoline rises, think of those poor people having to commute long distances for work. Because in fact, if you look at commuting patterns and so on, there's a very interesting set of correlations between those and low income and high income. Okay. By the way, the same argument holds for what might be termed a Pigovian subsidy. Okay? So if somebody's doing something good, you want to subsidize that activity. So let's take the case of biofuels. The standard argument is we have to move out of fossil fuels towards biofuels, okay? And therefore you subsidize biofuels, which is what's done in the US. Now, as you all know, the subsidy for biofuels and ethanol and all that is a huge political mess in the US and other parts of the world. It's corrupt, it's politically driven, we all know about the Iowa primary, and so on, and that issue comes up every time. And very, very few people resist the buckling under when they go to Iowa for those primaries. Okay? But just think about subsidizing biofuel. You can't get something for nothing. Okay? You subsidize biofuels, biofuel production increases. Where does the land come from to grow that extra biofuel, those crops? It presumably comes from land which was previously growing food crops. If then you reduce the production of food, the price of food rises. And some of the poor certainly will lose out as a result of that. So you can't get something for nothing. You can't say, well, we just subsidize biofuels and that's it, that's the end of the story. No, that's the easy way out. Somebody will lose as a result of this, and we have to be mindful of who the losers are, in particular if they're poor people. Of course, So we have Pigovian taxes or Pigovian subsidies which try to correct this externality, which try to correct this gap between market prices and social values. Okay? But as you introduce this subsidy or this tax, some people lose, some people gain. And our concern, I presume, because we're concerned with justice and inequality, is the poor losers, is those people who lose, those people who are poor who lose. And of course, you could design a very clever compensation scheme. And quite often, many of the proposals that many climate activists come up with are of that type. You could devise a very clever compensation scheme, right? You could say, well, what I'm going to do is to compensate these people in this way, and those people that way. Those people lose because they were coal miners. Those people lose because they were driving long distances, et cetera, et cetera. I have to raise the price of gasoline. We have to end coal. Some people will lose. And that's a very complicated pattern of who loses in this setting. So you will have to devise a very complicated, very clever compensation mechanism to get at each of these losses. If you really believe in justice, if you really believe in this issue that the poor should not be hurt as a result of this climate policy. But 2 points. First of all, such a scheme is very complicated to design. Okay? And typically, we have very crude instruments. We don't have these very fine instruments which separate out this from that from that, etc. Typically, we have very, very crude economic policy instruments for compensation. And secondly, who's going to pay for this compensation? Somebody somewhere, not future generations, because they're not here to pay for it. Somebody from this generation will have to pay for the compensation. Well, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it? So here is the economist's trade-off. Accepting that curbing carbon emissions is the right thing to do from the point of view of externalities between generations, what do you do if the only policy instruments available to you make the poor today worse off? That's the question. Okay? If you can devise a set of instruments which won't do that, great, fantastic. So the question is the future of the planet to be rescued at the backs of today's poor? But that sounds to me like a philosophical question. Okay? So let's move to some philosophy. Here's a quote from Henry Shue, my co-organizer of this conference, and as I said, a very distinguished philosopher of climate justice. And he says the following, given this nexus of issues that I've pointed out. He says, I see only 3 options. 1, go ahead and produce global warming, just go on emitting, thereby avoiding any decision to make carbon emissions zero-sum. You will be familiar with the zero-sum notion that, hold carbon emissions constant. 2, reduce our economic activity and standard of living, thereby living within our fair share of a zero-sum emissions total. And this is this externality business, tax this thing, that thing, et cetera, okay? And the third, which seems to me, as you'll see, is a get-out clause, really. Develop non-carbon-based energy resources. Everything, renewable, that's it. Non-carbon-based energy resources, thereby making carbon emission non-essential and making any zero-sum total irrelevant to most people's lives, thereby diffusing this issue of fairness. So his third thing is the way out from this issue of fairness, from this difficult question that I posed about saving the planet for the future versus doing it on the backs of today's poor. He says, well, if we could somehow have a different way of generating energy, if we could have renewable resources, et cetera, then we could have our cake and eat it too. Great, if you can do it. As he says, I believe the first option is dangerous and irresponsible towards future generations. That's the global warming option. The second option is politically and psychologically impossible. That leaves a third option as the only practical hope. And quite often in climate discourse, we're driven to this option because the first two are so difficult to reconcile with each other. So, is the third option the way out? I put it to you that this is what most people come down to in the end because of the difficulties. Would that it was so easy. Would that the third option was so easy. It's certainly easy to say in order to avoid the first two difficulties. First of all, where is the surety that we will indeed find the technological solutions? Although, of course, mankind has been very successful in technological endeavors. Okay? So we may be techno-optimists. We may have deep confidence in mankind that technology will always find the way out. You just have to put enough resources into it. Will the alternatives be found in good time? And if they're found in good time, will they not negatively impact those dependent on the production of fossil fuels? You see, you can't get around it. You can't get around it. I'll do renewable resources. That's it. That'll take care of it. No, it won't, because those who are previously dependent upon fossil fuels are going to be now negatively affected by it. If they're Saudi princes, no problem. Who cares? Okay? But West Virginian miners, Polish miners, Indian coal miners, I presume you do care. Those people will be put out of work. As you well know, in the current election cycle, West Virginia, this is a very big issue. So how are we going to handle that? I presume we're going to compensate. I presume we're going to devise some clever method. So one can't get around it simply by saying we're going to just move to renewable resources. You have to think about what's going to happen to all those activities which are associated with coal. They won't disappear overnight. Over a 20 to 30-year period, you're going to be handling the Polish coal miners, the Indian coal miners, the West Virginian coal miners, and so on. So compensation will be needed for those who are poorly negatively impacted. The question is, A, do we have the policy instruments? Do we have the fine-grained policy instruments which can take care of Indian coal miners, Polish coal miners, West Virginian coal miners, even leaving to one side Saudi princes? And secondly, do we have the political will? Who's going to pay for this? Who's going to find the compensation? Because the gainers from this are future generations. Remember, the externality is the cost that we're imposing on future generations. If we stop this activity, it's the future generations who gain. Great, but they're not paying for it. Okay? Who pays for it? It's this present generation which has to pay for this activity. Do we have the political will, therefore, to get that compensation? So I put it to you, are we then back to the same question? If the planet can be saved only by hurting today's poor, should it still be saved? And that's a philosophical question, okay? That's not something that economists get into, but this is, of course, not the only philosophical question in climate justice. You read the literature, there are many, many other philosophical questions. For example, should the well-being of unborn generations millennia hence, 10,000 years from now, be given the same weight as the well-being of today's generation? One can have religious perspectives on this, stewardship perspectives on this, and say, yes, actually, the weight that we give to a child born 10,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, should be the same as a child that's born into a poor household in India today. Do we really believe that? And how does this question relate, if at all, to the question whether the well-being of one's nearest and dearest now, here, should be given greater weight than the well-being of a poor person in a far-off place today? This is the question that's been raised by philosophers Peter Singer and Cornell philosopher Richard Miller. Peter Singer has a very, very clear view on this. He says, if there is a risk of a child dying in a far-off place in Africa, any consumption that any of us undertake above our basic needs is not morally justifiable. That's Peter Singer's view. Dick Miller takes the view that that's a shade too extreme. It would not comport with our normal behavior. The notion that I should not send my daughter to a better university if the fee was higher, and that I could use that difference in fee, if I could use that difference in fee to keep somebody alive miles away, that Peter Singer's position would be, yes, indeed, that's what you should do. You should not be sending your children you should not be buying that fine sweater for Christmas for your children. Okay? Well, these are very deep philosophical questions, okay? And now compare it to the first bullet, where I'm comparing the life of a child today with the life of a child 10,000 years from now. 10,000 years from now. Third question, do human rights apply in equal measure and in equal force to unborn generations? How do we think about that? Here's another one. Global warming favors and will favor some species over others. Some species will do rather well out of global warming. Thank you very much. Okay? How, if at all, should impact on non-human species be factored into the discourse on climate justice? We all talk only about on the human side of things, okay? And in any event, how do different specifications of justice translate into climate justice? Okay? I've been using a very narrow, economically oriented view of justice, essentially inequality, poverty, income, wealth, etc. There are, of course, many other notions of justice, fairness, equality of opportunity, and all that sort of stuff. How do these fit into the discourse on climate justice? But I end with the question to which, at least for me, there seems to be no easy answer. Maybe you have the answer. And I start again with the point. If we could redistribute resources sufficiently across countries and within countries, if we had the political will and the technical instruments to do this, then we could, in principle, get both intergenerational justice, justice between the generations, between now and 10,000 years from now, and intragenerational justice, justice in our time, justice between the rich and the poor today. Because climate justice, climate change is an injustice between generations. Our activities are leading to problems for future generations. But if in resolving that, we cause an injustice within our generation, and I'm putting it to you that our instruments and our political will are such that that is likely to happen, as I say, suppose as seems likely, we cannot achieve this. Then I put the question to you again. Should we save the planet for the future of humankind on the backs of today's poor? I think I know my answer to this question. I want to know what's your answer to this question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. My name is Jonathan Latham. My question to you is, your talk seems heavily premised on the idea that solving climate change is an expensive thing to do. Now, my understanding of this question is that there is a whole series of reports which show that solving climate change costs very little money. But you didn't go into that question, so I wonder how you support your premise in this case.
So thank you for that question. And so if climate change was indeed so easy to do, I presume we'd have done it. If it was, let me take the case where it was costless to do, okay? Then why don't we just do it? So the cost could be, if you're talking about cost in an aggregate sense, maybe that's right. Maybe all these externality fixing that I talked about in this generation, if one costed that out in some way as a fraction of world GDP, maybe that's quite small. Maybe. Okay? So that's one point. But secondly, and this is the point, that these costs fall differentially on different people. There's a distributional cost. There's a political economy cost. And getting around that has been, as we all know from climate negotiations and so on, has been the real issue. So I start with the notion, if the cost was zero, why hasn't it been done already?
You didn't answer my question. So I have read around this issue. Mm-hmm. There are a whole bunch of studies from Greenpeace, from independent universities, and so forth, which basically show that the cost of solving climate change is negligible. The only institution that claims that there is a very high cost of solving climate change is the National Association of Manufacturers, right? Which has reasons for their own for doing that. Right?
So, but you then
it's not correct.
No, well, first of all, I would disagree with you on that. In terms, as I said, in terms of a percentage, I agree that as a percentage of world GDP. Okay, as a percentage of world GDP, and that actually are the sorts of calculations that Greenpeace and the Stern report and all these reports do. Okay, so how do you calculate this? How does one do this? Okay, how does one actually do a calculation of this type? Okay. So you may say, well, suppose what I want to do is to reduce carbon emissions to a certain level. Okay. That then requires, assuming we have no technical progress which will allow us to achieve whatever, that then requires you to reduce output by a certain amount. Okay? There's no way out of it. You have to reduce output by a certain amount, and then you calculate what that is. You calculate what that amount is. And of course, the more adjustments you allow in your model, the more you allow the economy to adjust this way, that way, the lesser will that cost be. Because if you tell me I can't use carbon, then I'm going to use something else. Okay? And the more so there's a range of parameter values you can choose in these models. And of course, you can choose particular ones due to low numbers or high numbers. And I'm accepting that, say, for example, the calculations by the Stern report and so on, said that under their assumptions, the total cost of achieving zero carbon emissions, whatever, of this thing, will be a smallish percentage of world GDP. Yeah, that's fine. So why don't we do it?
Well, that's the question I'm getting to.
Yeah.
If it costs almost nothing, then presumably the reasons that have been given to us why we're not doing something are different.
So here's
actually been given. So what I'm saying is it's a super important question. Right? You haven't addressed the premise. You have two premises of your talk. Right? One is that it costs a lot of money, and the second is that there is a correlation between carbon dioxide production and the standard of living. And I'm suggesting to you both of those premises are incorrect, and therefore your discussion is essentially worthless.
No. Oh dear me, we're getting excited now. Okay, let me just say the following. Let me go to the particular analysis that I put forward for you, which is the analysis of externalities. Okay. So I said that the total size of the economic pie is smaller than it should be because there's this gap between market prices and true social cost. Okay? So if I was to bring the social cost and the social price together, closer to each other, the size of the overall pie would grow. Okay? So I would have to combine the costs of that, of these actions that I'm undertaking, as a ratio of the total pie. I don't believe I said that the cost of doing this is huge. What I said was that as you move towards efficiency, you're going to have distributional consequences. That was the brunt of my proposition. Okay? As you move towards efficiency, there'll be distributional consequences. And that's the trade-off that I don't believe we've faced up to. No, I think let's have some other questions, please.
Sure, of course, but this is a super important question.
Not really, no. I think because given the way that I put it, I hope other people can understand the conceptual frame in which I'm operating.
I think we have one
here. Yeah, this is a little bit related to the...
Sure.
But not quite as... I would immediately grant that we don't want to put this primarily on the backs of the poor and everybody else benefits. But two comments. One is, when you talk about a generation 10,000 years from now, we're also talking about all the generations in between. So that's a lot of generations and a lot of people that are paying the price. The second thing is that there's an awful lot of studies that say that today, the effects aren't all going to be felt by generations in future centuries, much less millennia. There are going to be major consequences in decades and certainly by the end of this century, and the poor living today will pay the highest price for those consequences. So trying to say that it's all a trade-off between the poor today and future generations, it seems to me, is not recognizing that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I mean, certainly, so first of all, there's a distinction between, as I'm sure all of you know, between mitigation and adaptation. Okay? If all emissions were to stop today, the carbon that's going to cause the problems is already in the atmosphere for sea level rise and so on. Okay? So what you're pointing to is, in fact, the adaptation side of the story, where those sea levels are going to rise, and actually those will lead to distributional consequences now, even if we were to stop all carbon emissions today. So the question is, how are we going to address that? And that will require major forms of redistribution towards those poor who are losing as a result of this. So that's first point, the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. The second point is a philosophical question. You're absolutely right. There are all these generations who we're adding up. And of course, if I take this to infinity and I don't discount, then every single action of today is trumped by anything to do with the future. Just technically, it is. Okay? So if either you're going down that road, which means that every single action of today is trumped, or one's saying, no, there's a certain amount of discounting that we're doing. This is actually the generations which are closest to us, rather like our nearest and dearest versus those far away, close to are indeed worth more than not. Okay? So once you go into discounting, it's the rate of discount that matters. Okay? What rate of discount are we going to use? The closer you go to zero, the closer it comes. The closer you come to basically saying it's tomorrow that matters and not today. So I don't think one gets around the basic issues in this the basic fundamental issues. I don't think one gets around it in this. And again, my conclusion is not is not the one shouldn't be doing these climate change activities. I'm posing to you a philosophical question. I'm posing to you a question of a trade-off. And I'm asking you, how would you deal with this? And one way around it is it's not a problem. Well, great, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem, okay? Another way to say it, there is a problem, and we have to have a way of thinking through what this means. How do you weigh the well-being of a poor person today versus future generations? And if somehow that's seen as getting around the climate change issue, I don't think so. I think it's posing the question. Yeah.
I was just trying to say, I mean, the poor that are alive today, not future generations, today's poor. You know, when we see studies that large parts of the Middle East will become uninhabitable because they'll be too hot, and parts of India will be like that. The rich will move and the poor will suffer.
Absolutely, that's an adaptation question again.
Areas that are drying out because of changes in distribution of rainfall. The rich will move away and adapt. They'll buy food from distant countries because and the poor will suffer. So I don't think that it's a trade-off between today's poor and the future so cleanly.
No, I agree with you. It's not quite so clean. But on the other hand, it still persists. It will not go away. It will not go. It will not go away. And the sense in which it will not go away, that's what we as analysts I believe, should be focusing on. What's the precise sense in which it will not go away? And I don't have an answer to that. But I don't believe other people do either. That's my. Yes, please, madam. Yes.
From the web,
Yes.
real quick. All right. We have a question.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Here we go.
Okay, long question. We seem satisfied to tax big corporations. However, while corporations may be assessed taxes, they don't really pay taxes. The consumers of their goods and services do. So in that way, are these taxes not just become more on the backs of the poor? And who is the receiver of all these taxes, and what faith do we have that they will be properly and equitably use these taxes? Government, we've seen how they've misused social security taxes or tobacco industry settlements.
Yeah, so I think this comes down to whether or not we have the instruments, the right instruments to help achieve this goal of climate justice, both intergenerational and intragenerational. And what this gentleman or lady is raising is that in fact the instruments that we have are imperfect. So again, as I said, economic theory is quite clear on this. If you have a perfect set of distributional instruments, which are known in economics as lump sum instruments, if you have lump sum instruments, you can fix that problem, you can fix this problem, you can fix that problem, you can fix that problem. If you have a set of instruments, you can fix everything. The point is we don't have those instruments, and that's why there's a trade-off. That's why there's a problem. And we can't get around it by saying there's no trade-off. There is a trade-off. Yeah.
Is this the from what I understand, your framework is that you are saying that in order to get rid of climate change, we need to tax fossil fuel producing companies so that so that the cost of climate carbon producing companies will go down, but this will be also a cost to the poor.
Yes.
But the thing that you leave out is that there is an equal cost to the poor if we don't stop climate change. That the climate change itself will be a cost to the poor. I think that's what this gentleman was saying. So the way you've set up your question is misleading because it doesn't account for the fact that we're going to lose either way. So if we're going to lose either way, just the process of trying to solve the problem, whether we choose to do it all one way, I mean, obviously everybody is going to be doing it in their own way. Just solving the problem or not solving the problem in any way becomes the ethical question. Because if we don't try, that's where we fail future generations.
Yeah. So again, I mean, we're all trying. We're all trying out different instruments. Okay, the question is, what are the consequences of each instrument that we try out? And the most common suggested thing is a generalized carbon tax. Okay, and again, conceptually, that's what we think. Essentially, we want to make the use of carbon more expensive in some way. And there are lots of specific ways in which you can do that. But the generalized carbon tax is safe. Now, you're exactly right that the consequences of climate change for the poor can be negative, clearly. But the consequences of addressing it are also. Who said that these two are exactly equal? Do we know? Do we have an analysis to show that in fact this is less weighty than this? And I would say that in order to make that comparison, we will need to have a value judgment as to how we weight those two. Yeah, so please go.
We don't really need an analysis because we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to make capitalism better. I mean, we have an opportunity to solve social justice problems and earth justice problems. I mean, we don't need one way of doing it. There are multiple ways of doing it.
Yes.
There's multiple ways to cut consumption, to tax, to do whatever we do, because just proceeding is the virtuous thing to do.
Well, so this is where perhaps we differ a little bit in the sense that there are many, many different ways of doing these things. And of course, as I said, there are many, many instruments, and everybody's doing their thing, etc. If we put all that together, first of all, has anybody put it together to ask the question, who are the gainers and the losers from this process? And if in fact the gainers are in the future, and there are some losers in the future, and there are gainers and losers in the present situation as well, how are you going to say whether we should move in this direction or that direction? I don't know that one can morally say that we're just going to move forward, that's it, without saying what are the consequences of moving forward in this way. Now, I suppose one could make a very general set of a proposition saying moving in this way is on average better than moving in this way, perhaps. Anyway, yeah, sorry. Go. Yes, please. We can come back to your question.
Okay, question. Can we factor in the economics of altruism and pro-social conduct?
Yes, indeed you can. Yes, indeed you can. But don't forget envy as well. Okay, so altruism and envy are externalities in the economic setting. Okay, so if I do something, if I do something and it benefits you, and I feel good about it, that's an externality to me. If I feel badly about it because you've done rather well, that's a negative externality to me. So these things are indeed incorporated in a very general type of economic analysis as well. Yes.
Hi. We were talking about a number of ways of doing things, but there's one that has, there's been analysis done, and that's the carbon fee and dividend. And so there you have a carbon tax. It's upstream, so it's on, the production. And then the revenue from that carbon tax is given back to households equally. And what that does is to actually give the poor more than what the increased costs due to that carbon tax would be. And it actually incentivizes those that are at the wealthy end to decrease their carbon consumption.
Yes, so I would agree. So first of all, if in fact it was costless, we wouldn't need to do that. Let me make that point first of all. So presumably there is some cost to it, and these schemes are now being put forward to address those issues. So yes, indeed. I mean that's one particular scheme, which is a carbon tax with a uniform dividend and so on. Now one can do a detailed analysis of that as well, and then the question would be whether it's going to be a global carbon tax and a global dividend, or is it going to be a national carbon tax and a national dividend? How is this going to affect the Indian coal miners, etc.? So there'd be that class of questions, but leave that This is what I meant by saying we do have those instruments, but we don't have a complete set of instruments to address all of those. Okay? And that's my question. If we don't have a complete set of instruments to do it, then what? I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying don't do it. Don't get me wrong.
And the thing is that this would be national. And it's just water. This would be national, and there is a Porter adjustment which incentivizes other countries to do the same.
Yeah. So there are, as I said, there are these very clever schemes that one can work these things out. Okay, and then of course it's not. First of all, it's not as straightforward as that, because when one does these things, always other things in the system also change. Okay, demands change and so on. So you have to factor all those things into this, because some of the money that's spent out of the dividend will be spent on carbon-intensive commodities. So one has to take a full general equilibrium perspective on this thing. So that's one point. And then, yeah, again, it's certainly true that there exists a clever set of instruments and et cetera. But my question to you is 2 points. Firstly, if that's an incomplete set, that's 1 point. And secondly, suppose there's a political economy constraint that you can't do it, which is what we're seeing right now. Okay, it's not the technical aspect of it. It's that some people are going to lose out as a result of this, and they're not letting it happen. So suppose there's a political economy. So either if we don't have the instruments, or if we don't have the will to do it, then what?
You now have oil companies, big banks asking for a carbon tax.
Well,
so I think that we're getting to a political economy where it is, in fact, doable. We also now have a bipartisan caucus for climate solutions in the Congress. Things are moving forward.
Okay, and of course I welcome that. It's not that I don't welcome it. I'm posing a tighter question than that, okay, which is what happens if those things don't move forward now? Yeah, this one, yes.
Hi, I know you mentioned the tax, but I was just wondering if you had a preference for bill being taxed over the bill being subsidies that you mentioned, and is there any circumstance that you can foresee when there is not a lot of government interaction in trying to force these hands?
Say that again, please.
Is there any circumstance that you see where it doesn't require a lot of intimate government, either taxes or subsidies, that will help facilitate this change?
So, in reality, I don't believe so, but conceptually, in economics, there's a conceptual way in which it can proceed, okay? And I'll give you an example of that. Is go back to the laundry factory example. So there's one suggestion is that suppose I was to give the laundry, so to speak, the rights to free air. In other words, the factory has to get permission from the laundry to do this, its pollution. Well, then you get a bargaining between the laundry and the factory, okay, which actually happens in reality in many cases if I'm using somebody's land or whatever it is and so on. And then the suggestion, at least conceptually in theory, is that they would arrive at a price which would match the laundry's costs to the factory's benefits. So that's an example put forward by an economist called Ronald Coase, where this would happen. But there are all sorts of reasons why I personally don't believe that's a conceptual thing, but in reality, in practice, you can see why that might not lead to the full optimum outcome. So I'm a believer that it has to be government intervention which will do this.
Hi, so I guess I have a statement and a question. So the statement, basically, the way I see it, like the things that are driving climate change are also driving other social injustices, like external to just carbon. So like fossil fuel industries and just, the pollution of their extraction and their infrastructure leakages and just a system that just ignores externalities in general, as far as pollution goes and social inequality, etc. So I think those problems, that's not intergenerational inequality. Those are in the present generation, and by addressing the sources of, the carbon emitters, the carbon emissions themselves might be, if you had stopped emissions, then like you'd be helping people 40 years plus down the line, or something to that extent. But I guess the effect of like addressing those inequalities, like making those the people who are the sources of those carbon emissions pay for, I guess, the inequalities that they're causing today, like just from pollution. That's sort of the way I would make that compromise in my mind. And the question for me is, Bernie Sanders' platform, he says he's going to solve this. And he says he's going to solve it by making fossil fuel companies pay for green jobs and installing wind and solar, et cetera. How do you think he's going to do that?
Yeah, well, a good question. But let me go back to this thing of existing injustices and existing inequalities. Okay. And there are, of course, myriad of those. There are legion. Those are legion, okay? And it's not just anything to do with fossil fuel emission or anything like that. There's land inequality and wealth inequality, etc. And there are issues to do with labor markets and power imbalances within labor markets, etc. There's so many of those things. And so actually, much of my work is to do with those sorts of inequalities. Yeah. And the question to my mind is, yes, of course, if in fact, if one can establish that addressing those inequalities will also address the climate issue, fine and dandy, that's great. If we can show that addressing the climate issue will also address these inequalities, fine and dandy, that's great. Okay? I'm just saying that empirically, I have some questions about that. And if empirically you accept that there's at least some grain of truth in that, then conceptually you have to come down to the point about balancing out this versus that. That's really the essence of what I'm trying to say. I won't comment on the Bernie Sanders program. Okay? So as I said, inequality, climate change. Inequalities today, addressing those may address climate change. Great. Climate change, addressing that may address inequalities. And indeed, there are many cases where it does. But I hope the examples I gave suggest that there are many cases where it doesn't. And I think that we're getting around it by a sleight of hand. We're saying we'll do compensation. We'll put $100 billion in the Paris COP. Okay? And we know that's never going to happen. That's not going to come through. That's whatever. Or we'll say we're going to develop renewable resources, etc. And actually, I think it gets us off the hook. It gets us off the hook for designing compensation schemes for the losers of today. And to my mind, that is for me at any rate, that's a huge concern. That's a huge concern.
Okay, we have one more from the WebEx, and then maybe time for one more from the audience after that.
So I guess that the question or the statement is that in environmental economics, we do have mechanisms, carbon cap and trade, that are already being used and have reduced. They've been very effective to reduce air pollution in the US and globally. So can you comment on that? And I guess my take-home message is this is not an economic issue, it's a political issue.
Yeah, so I think I was sort of getting at that, and I said that a number of times. We have the political will to do these. The economic part of it is that when you use one instrument to try and fix one thing, be aware that there isn't another problem that you're causing, that you're not causing. That, to me, is the economist's perspective on this. Okay, so you try to fix this intergenerational problem. If you had 1 million different instruments, you could, of course, fix that and fix this. But if you try to fix the intergenerational problem with a limited set of instruments, I think empirically you are likely to cause a problem over here. That's really what I was trying to get across.
All right. Well, let's thank Dr. Ravi Kanbur again.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.